that. All right, now we're going to go into evolution. I apologize if this seems a little bit fast-tracked. I'm running a little bit late, but that's okay. The first the dot point on there is to define evolution, macroevolution, and microevolution. So these three I have copied straight from the QCEE glossary. Evolution is the change in genetic composition of a population over generations, which which may result in the development of a new species. So anytime a species has devolved from its common ancestor, something regarding evolution has happened. Macroevolution is like large scale evolution, where it's the variation of allele frequencies um, over geological time in a particular species, resulting in the divergence of its taxonomic group, where the descendant is in a different taxonomic group to the ancestor. That's how you know a new species has been formed, where the descendants are no longer in the same taxa. If you think back to classification systems, microevolution, on the other hand, is small scale allele variation, which within a species where the descendant is in the same taxonomic group. So, an example of macroevolution would be the division of humans and then ape species from a common ancestor, a common mammal ancestor. Microevolution, an example, is the variation of height and skin color across the human population. Um, just because somebody has, blonde hair doesn't mean that they're a different species to me. It's just a difference in allele variation. So that's a microevolutionary change. In terms of what evolution is, the Earth can be mapped out according to all of these eras and all of these timelines. And because like all of these areas are characterized by different kind of environmental conditions, different kind of predator and prey relationships, and different levels of biodiversity. All of these differences cause selection pressures or things that affect a population from surviving and thriving. And sometimes there are, mass extinction events that take place. Sometimes there are sudden boosts in biodiversity. And every single time a selection pressure, affects a population, their ability to adapt to that selection pressure and change their allele frequencies and traits is what results in evolution. And so there are some important terms for you to know. The first one is mass extinctions. So mass extinctions are any periods of time where a large amount of species are dying out due to changes in environmental pressures. The species that dies out can no longer exist, so there are no species left, but there can be ancestors of these species that have evolved to become a new species. The opposite of mass extinctions are evolutionary radiation, which you can see here. And evolutionary radiation is basically, within a very short amount of time, the rapid expansion of species from a smaller number of related organisms. Evolutionary radiation can also be called adaptive radiation. They're the same thing. But basically, what you see here is differences in genetic diversity and allele frequencies can cause evolutionary radiation, which can also be influenced by things like climate change, geological change, atmospheric change, and ecological opportunities. A mass extinction is where multiple different species become extinct, and sometimes a mass extinction where all of these species are dying out opens up new niches within an ecosystem, which creates the need for evolutionary radiation. So all of these species start to divide really, really quickly, forming new species to fill up those niches that were left behind by the ones who died out previously. And so you can sort of track how these happen. So yeah, evolution is the opposite to mass extinction. Here there probably was a event that caused species to diverge really, really quickly, and this one common ancestor suddenly broke up into multiple different kinds of species within one or so eras. So that's a example of adaptive radiation there. Hopefully that is all making sense. Oh boy. And so with the aries, right? Any sorts of these diagrams that we get are made by sequencing the DNA of all of these organisms. So we get samples of, fossil records, samples of organisms that we already have living, and we can compare them to see their similarity in their genetics. The more similar an organism's genetics are to one another, the more closely related that they would be. We talked a little bit about DNA sequencing. That process is what is used to do this. Um, the official name for mapping out an organism's genome and comparing it to another organism is called DNA hybridization. And here we're extracting the DNA of two different species, cleaving it into like fragments using restriction enzymes and heating them to create hybrids with each other. The more similar base pairs exist between two DNA hybrids, the more similar those organisms were originally, and then the more related they are in the evolutionary timeline. A very common but less accurate method used is to compare organisms based on their comparative homology. So homology is literally their physical features as well. But sometimes physical structures aren't necessarily developed because of common ancestors. Sometimes it's because of common environments. So comparing genetics and DNA hybridization is always going to be more accurate than molecular homology. So with molecular homology, we can go into phylogenetic relationships. You would have come across this briefly in Unit 3 when we were looking at how to define species. But to put it simply, phylogenetic relationships are looking at how similar DNA sequences are between organisms that we know. So comparative genomics, or comparing genomes between organisms, relates to all of the similarities and differences that we can see between individual gene sequences, transcription factors, the presence of duplicated genes, non-coding DNA, and repeated DNA sequences, which are the STRs that I was talking about before. If a species has a very similar set of proteins or chromosomes or DNA sequences, it's interpreted as evidence that they would have come from a common ancestor beforehand, and they would have diverged or evolved differently somewhere down the timeline. Recent, though, in terms of evolutionary relationships, can mean thousands, hundreds, or even millions of years. Everything sort of comparative to the billions and billions of years that the Earth has been around for already. So phylogenetic classification, which is what you see on the screen here, is the classification of organisms based on their evolutionary traits. And a phylogenetic tree is a diagram that shows how similarly related organisms are. So on this diagram, we have three different organisms that are being compared against each other: the camel, the peccary, and the pig. All of these are mammals. So we immediately know that they were somewhat related to each other down the line. Here you can see that the base pair sequences, part of their genome's been extracted, and all of the differences have been identified. The blue bits are the similar, and the black bits are the different sequences. So sometimes they can just be a base pair here and there, sometimes it's an entire codon. So those differences are then extracted and then summarized in a table. So between the camel and the peccary, there's 15 differences. Camel and the pig have 13 differences. Peccary and the pig have 6 differences. And so those can be mapped out on a diagram. Sorry. Here, where the camel was the first one to break away from the common ancestor, because it's the one with the least amount of similarity. And then the pig and the peccary are the ones that broke away much later down the line. You can either have a scaled tree, which is what you see on your left-hand side, where all of the lines kind of are proportional to the time it took to diverge. Or you can have an unscaled tree, which is a cladogram. Again, think back to Unit 3, which is just, lines showing relationships where the length of the line doesn't really matter too much. So being able to interpret some of these diagrams is what will help you answer these kinds of questions in your external. So I have some practice questions for you now. How are we going for time? Okay, I've got about 15 minutes left, which is good. I want to see if you guys can answer this question. I'll obviously go through the answer at the end of the lesson, but because there are 4 marks on this question, this is a paper 1 question from one of the externals. Have a go at even just writing down some dot points that can be used. So you're asked to explain microevolutionary change through mutations. 4 marks means you need to be giving 4 pieces of information. So I want you to have a think, maybe for the next 2 minutes, as to what they may be. And I will go through the answer after. Okay, I will go through the answer now. The first one, the first thing that you need to say is that mutations happen at a natural rate. So mutations within a population occur naturally. Um, Introducing new alleles into the gene pool. New alleles into the gene pool. What this means is that these mutations can be beneficial to survival. So these alleles could increase the rates of survival, compared to the existing gene pool? They could be neutral, so they have no effect on survival, or decrease survival chances. If there is an selection pressure, that a new allele can work to improve. Oh, oops. Oh, wait, did I just get rid of my... No, okay. I'll just go here. I'll paraphrase. Sorry. Mutations increase... Oh, mutations are natural and they increase the number of alleles. They can be beneficial, detrimental to survival, or neutral. If there is an environmental pressure, the a new allele is beneficial against selection pressure. There is an increased chance of offspring being born with this allele. If this happens over, multiple generations, this continues to occur over time. The new allele's frequency will increase. And existing allele frequencies will decrease. Will decrease, causing microevolutionary change. And you basically get 1 mark for talking about the natural rates of mutations, 1 mark for saying that it makes more alleles which can have, beneficial, detrimental, or neutral effects. 1 mark for saying how the allele frequencies can change over time if the new allele helps with the current environment. And finally, that change in allele frequency is what we call a microevolutionary change. All right. Explain a possible consequence of a population bottleneck. All right. Couple of things here. I need to go through the theory for you here. Population bottlenecks kind of align with mass extinctions, where it's the dying off of a species within a very short amount of time, of multiple species. Species in a very short amount of time. So, for example, if you had an ecosystem that had 57 species, and then there was a natural disaster, like a forest fire, that wiped out until there were only 10 resulting. This rapid decrease is a population bottleneck. And it happens in a very short amount of time because of a natural disaster. And sometimes the surviving population can be representative of the original population. But oftentimes, the surviving population is a lot more vulnerable. And I'll just explain why. If I go back to my example that I've given you of the 57 original species that existed here, let's say that 20 of these species were producers, 17 of these species were herbivores, and 15 of these species were small predators, and the remaining 15 were higher order predators or large predators. Predators. Let's say in the surviving population, we could have had one producer, three herbivores, three higher order predators, sorry, small predators, and three higher order predators. Or we could have had 10 higher order predators as the remaining population after this natural disaster. One of the species has one kind of organism from each of the main niches. There's like something that can produce the food, something that can eat the producer, and then a couple of predators to eat the herbivores, prey species. In the second case, where all of the surviving organisms are predators that need prey to survive, that second scenario has the organisms kind of struggling to survive. There's no diversity. And the reason why this happened is because, yes, because of a natural disaster, but sometimes it's completely random. There's not enough time in one of these like severe natural disasters for natural selection to take place and the survival of the fittest to occur. The resulting populations can either be like super representative of the original, or they can be a really, really bad representation of the original population. So, population bottlenecks, if I was to answer this question, population bottlenecks occur during um mm, oh sorry like rapid natural disasters, often resulting in an extremely reduced vulnerable surviving population. Because of the decreased biodiversity, this population is at risk of because of the decreased biodiversity, the environmental pressures take a greater effect because we don't know if they're ready to adapt to this environment or not. Take a great effect meaning they must quickly adapt or go extinct. So that's one of the consequences. They adapt really quickly and undergo adaptive radiation or go extinct because they're unable to cope with the environment. Obviously, the more representative the population is, the more likely that the adaptive radiation will be successful. And the more vulnerable a population is, the more likely that they're going to go extinct, unfortunately. All right, my final question for you guys is one with a little graph here. So this graph is showing you the number of families in an ecosystem across all of the geological time periods. So your question is to state which geological period reptiles first appeared. So reptiles refer to this like gray color here. And if I trace it back to the origins, they kind of originate at this point, which is in the Carboniferous period. And you get 1 mark for saying that. If you wanted to calculate how many families of mammal were present 5 million years ago, 5 million years ago is the very, very end of the graph. And so we're wanting to track how many mammals first started. So that comes around 200 to about 325. So the total amount of families occupied by the mammals was 125 families. Infer when a mass extinction occurred. So we're looking for like rapid decreases in biodiversity. The first one I would probably say here at the very end of the Cretaceous period, or alternatively at the end of the Permian era, but the Permian one was slower than the Cretaceous period. So mass extinction at the end of the Permian era was not as significant as the mass extinction of the Cretaceous period. And so either at the end of the Permian era or the Cretaceous area. And the reason why we know this is because of the sudden drop in families and species.